I'm Alan Barrett. I'm the director of the ESRI, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to today's webinar. And I think, as you all know, this is actually a joint webinar with our colleagues in the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. So it's a great pleasure to welcome the folks from that organisation, in particular to welcome Sinead Gibney, who is the Chief Commissioner. So the main purpose of today's webinar is to launch the new report that you've all been hearing about during the course of the day. So this is the jointly published IHREC ESRI publication on monitoring adequate housing in Ireland. And in a short while, my colleague Helen Russell will take you through the details of the report. We'll also be hearing some remarks from Sinead herself. And delighted to also say we've had a speech recorded at this event by the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing. That's Professor Balal Krishnan Rajagopal. So I hope I did an okay job pronouncing his name. I'm doing it actually with a cat meowing here beside me, so apologies for that disruption. Hopefully the cat will settle down. So I'm not going to say a huge amount or much at all really about the housing report. I think between our three contributors, you'll hear plenty about the report. I just wanted to say a brief word really about more broadly about the research program that ourselves and the Institute and IHREC have been running for the last 4 years. So since 2017, IHREC have very generously provided funding to the Institute to undertake work on a variety of topics, including things like disability, caring and unpaid work, and then also attitudinal research towards diversity and migration in Ireland. So again, IHREC have provided the funding and also have sort of engaged very proactively with the Institute in producing a series of what are now 10 reports on various aspects of inequality, discrimination, and the range of issues that are core concern to IHREC. So I just want to formally thank the organisation and indeed Sinead for that support and collaboration over the last number of years. We're immensely proud, actually, I have to say, of the volume of work that is now built up. One-off reports are always great, but the accumulation of reports and the accumulation of knowledge is really, really fantastic. So we're delighted that body of work now exists. Generally speaking, this work has been quite influential. I mean, we normally, measure that in terms of the extent to which it's cited and people talk about it in policy debates. So I think this has been tremendously important. But if I could have a sort of a brief confessional moment from my own perspective, economists like me typically get very sort of queasy about when you start talking about a human rights perspective on something that might ultimately be about public provision. Okay, and there's almost like a sort of an innate reaction to this, human rights framework, that in some sense the sensible control of public policy or public expenditure is going to be, handed over to somebody, and this is a very dangerous thing. And I think, speaking as an economist, and I think I can speak on behalf of a lot of my economics colleagues, there is an innate sort of concern or suspicion about this framework. But one of the great things about working in the ESRI, and always sort of stress there is an S as well as the E in ESRI, it's great from my perspective to sort of be challenged by my colleagues in the Institute, and also then by the wider stakeholder group, in this case the IHREC colleagues, who sort of bring a perspective on a particular issue that forces people like me to challenge how we perceive certain issues. So I have to say, through this program, I think my sort of appreciation and understanding of a range of issues is really, really advanced. I'd like to think if that happened to me, hopefully maybe it has happened to others, and they may not admit it as readily. But it really is a useful and an interesting way and an interesting framework, a challenging framework to think about these sort of issues. So I'd like to think that my experience of this work has sort of been replicated by a whole range of other people. In the context of talking about the research program, I just want to say a brief word of thanks to Iris Elliott. Iris is head of policy and research at IHREC and was probably our closest contact point over the years in working through the report. So many thanks to Iris. I think the intention is to sort of put the pause button on the research program for the time being, which can often be a very, very good thing, because you want to sort of rethink the sort of strategic priorities from a research program. But I sincerely hope that the ESRI and IHREC can sort of pick up these issues at some stage in the future, and to sort of carry on adding to that body of work that I mentioned just before. So before I end, it's always very important for me to thank my ESRI colleagues who have worked very diligently on this report. So Helen Russell, Ivan Pravalko, Francis McGinnity, and Shannon Enright are the authors of the report today. And again, I always like to congratulate my colleagues on a fine piece of work. And as I said earlier on, to sort of challenging my thinking in this area, which again, I do appreciate. Okay, so the plan now is we are going to take the video clip from the UN Special Rapporteur. After that, Sinead will make her contribution, followed by Helen Russell, who will present the report on behalf of the authors. And then we hope to have maybe about 20-25 minutes for Q&A. At the end of Helen's presentation, and as you're all now familiar, you want to submit questions through the Q&A function. I'll do my best to pass them on to Helen and hopefully sort of facilitate as lively a discussion as possible. So with those introductory remarks, is it possible now that we move on to the video presentation?
Dear Mr. Barrett, honorable participants, dear friends, it is a pleasure for me to speak at this event, launching the report of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and the Economic and Social Research Institute on monitoring adequate housing. Let me first and foremost express, as UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, my gratitude to the Human Rights and Equality Commission and the research team of ESRI for their outstanding report. I would be pleased if other national human rights institutions would undertake similar important research and monitoring of the right to adequate housing. This report is based on the definition of the right to adequate housing in international human rights law and presents a corresponding set of indicators for monitoring the realization of the right to adequate housing in Ireland. Like in several other advanced economies, many people in Ireland live in adequate housing. We should all be thankful for this, but just monitoring housing data for the entire population would hide serious housing rights issues and concerns that still many people face in Ireland. I'm therefore pleased that this report analyzes, as far as official disaggregated data is available, how the right to adequate housing is enjoyed by different social groups, including marginalized groups. The report concludes that there is a need to improve data collection on the right to adequate housing by people from different ethnic backgrounds, religion, gender identity, and sexual orientation. It highlights that there is insufficient data on people living in homelessness, caravans, or in various institutional settings, like persons living in care homes, hospitals, prisons, accommodation centers for refugees, and asylum centers, seekers, as national survey data does not capture the actual housing situation of people in such settings. I can only call on the Irish authorities and the National Statistical Office to fill this gap. As far as homelessness is concerned, it should be noted that the European Parliament Social Affairs Committee voted some weeks ago in favor of an amendment to the EU budget 2022, allowing for a €1 million pilot project on data collection on homelessness throughout Europe. I hope that Budget Committee of the European Parliament will as well approve this. We need better, regular, comprehensive, and more comparable data on homelessness in Ireland and in many other countries in Europe. The same applies to evictions and their prevention, which remains a global phenomenon, or the enjoyment of the right to adequate housing of LGBTI persons, in particular LGBTI youth. The report notes that there is not much data on whether current institutional legal frameworks actually prevent adequately discrimination in the field of housing, including against homeless people. This is very important, especially in the light of the judgment of the European Court of Human Rights recently in Lakatos versus Switzerland. Secondly, we also do not know fully if victims of housing discrimination are able to receive timely and effective relief. Research conducted by the Fundamental Rights Agency of Europe and academics concerning travelers and persons of African descent suggests so. If you're a traveler, have a foreign surname, look non-European, the chances to get a rental contract you applied for, to get credit, or a mortgage for buying housing are reduced. I was quite shocked that this report reveals that one group, single or lone parent households, appears to be particularly disadvantaged on nearly all housing rights dimensions assessed by this report. Single parents and their children account for 53% of all homeless families and are much more likely to experience poor housing than other households. And they face nearly 4 times as frequently compared to the general population affordability problems. Nearly half of them have to rely on the rental market for housing compared to only 20% of the general population. They are the most impoverished and face more significantly, more often arrears in paying for their housing costs and are among those with the lowest security of tenure and highest risk of evictions. They're also more likely to live in substandard housing with low quality. This raises a fundamental question. How can we as a society be actually treating single parents and their children? We speak here not about a few individuals. 1 out of 5 persons in Ireland lives in a single parent household, and 86% of lone parents in Ireland are women. We all have to therefore ask ourselves, how are we ensuring that everyone has equal access to safe and adequate home? If we are not serious about ending gender discrimination, if we want to end discrimination of children who just happen to grow up with their mother or father, then you must act, and act now. This is just one of the more concerning findings of this excellent study. This report provides data on what is close to my heart. We need to be more serious about ending housing discrimination and curb as well the adverse impact of spatial segregation on various human rights, including the right to adequate housing, education, healthcare, and equal access to public services. Dear ladies and gentlemen, an important step to ensure that the right to adequate housing can be relied on in courts and before public administration and entities would be to enshrine this right in the Irish Constitution, as many other countries have done. I therefore can only fully support this recommendation made by the Chief Commissioner. It would also be an important step towards implementing a core recommendation contained in the UN guidelines for the implementation of the right to adequate housing. The research and data on which this study is based has been largely collected before or at the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. I am pleased that the Irish government tried to protect mortgage payers and tenants in rented accommodation by imposing temporary measures to prevent a large wave of evictions, responding to my call as UN Special Rapporteur for a global moratorium on evictions during the pandemic. However, the pandemic is not over, and one of my deepest concerns is what happens now after these temporary measures have been lifted? How can we ensure that we do not see a massive wave of evictions in Ireland, Europe, the US, and many other states? How can we prevent a further increase of homelessness, which is one of the most severe violations of the right to adequate housing? How can we prevent a crisis from becoming a catastrophe? Let me conclude by referring to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations that have also been endorsed by the government of Ireland. One of the SDG targets specifies that everyone should have access to a safe and adequate housing by 2030. I believe this is possible, in particular in a relatively prosperous society such as Ireland. Let us therefore do the utmost to prevent any new wave of evictions. And ladies and gentlemen, let us be serious to end homelessness. It is possible to do so. Homelessness can be radically reduced, at least marginal proportions, as Finland, another European country, has shown recently, if there is political will to do so. Many thanks. I wish you all a nice afternoon and fruitful deliberations.
Great. Well, it was a real honor to have the Special Rapporteur, Raja Gopal, address, and he certainly picked up many of the issues, but there's no doubt the focus on lone parents, I think, is the one that has sort of captured, people's thoughts, and interesting that he did likewise. Okay, so with that, I'm going to invite Sinead Gibney then to address the webinar. So it's great pleasure to. I know it's a bit of a joint event. It's a total joint event actually, but I still feel I can welcome you anyway to this. So over to you.
Warm greetings to everyone, and thanks, Alan, for the welcome. And I'm really glad that we had the recorder on for your confessional. I think it's always great to hear economists concede to human rights. So glad to see that. And thank you for the kind words about the partnership on this research. I agree, it's been such a wonderful body of work that's been produced between our two organisations. And although, as you say, we're pausing it, I think the partnership is there now. So I look forward to future work between our two organisations and building on what we've done already. And absolutely important words we've just heard from Professor Raja Gopal, and we're honoured that the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing has contributed to the launch of this report at this critical moment in Irish housing policy. I find that it's always very interesting to see through the eyes of someone looking into Ireland from the outside. And I think his reaction to the situation for lone parents should give us all pause for thought. So today, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and the ESRI are publishing new research which examines the right to adequate housing and places it in the context of Ireland's housing policy developments and known inequality in the housing market. The Taoiseach recently described the housing as the single most urgent and important social issue facing our country at this moment in time. A front door, a family house, a first rental, accommodation that allows you to live in the way that you want to, and for those lucky enough, a true home with safety and security. It's impossible to put a value on the significance of a home in our lives. Adequate housing is necessary for the achievement of other fundamental rights, such as health and family life, and is central to the quality of life of adults and children. Our homes underpin our ability to access work and school. Housing deprivation has so many knock-on impacts, including poor mental and physical health, and in worse cases, homelessness and deaths, which have consequences not just for individuals, but also for wider society. Everyone has the right to live somewhere with security, peace, and dignity, and the state has a responsibility to meet international standards to achieve this. A rights-based approach to housing not only acknowledges that housing is more than bricks and mortar, it also combats inequality in housing, which is pervasive across the Irish housing sector, as evidenced in this report. In accepting the significant role that adequate housing plays in our quality of life and society, we need to foster an environment in Ireland where adequate housing is recognised, is affordable, and where security, habitability, and environment are essential considerations. The government's recently published Housing for All plan acknowledges the existing failures of Ireland's housing system and proposes its plan to address them. It acknowledges the specific needs of particular groups, including people with a disability, older people, and travellers, including the need for more and improved traveller-specific accommodation. It also highlights the commitment to end homelessness by 2030, as signed under the Lisbon Declaration in 2021. However, such ambition needs to be matched now by a clear implementation plan, more granular detail, and significant and sustained state investment to ensure housing delivery. Furthermore, a clearer government commitment is needed on the right to adequate housing. Housing policy in Ireland must stop primarily treating housing as a commodity and treat adequate housing as a basic human right. The right to adequate housing puts an emphasis on the state's role and purpose in ensuring that people have a suitable place to live. Recognising the right to adequate housing does not mean free housing for all. The UN has emphasised that the right to adequate housing does not require the state to build housing for the entire population. Instead, recognising the right to adequate housing covers measures required to prevent homelessness, ensures security of tenure to all, guarantees that housing is adequate and that it protects the most vulnerable. And this can be achieved through legislation, regulation, policy, or public spending. And it's not a radical or outlandish idea. Looking at countries across Europe, the right to housing is recognised in the constitutions of Belgium, Finland, Greece, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and Sweden, and in the legislation of Austria, France, Germany, Luxembourg, and the UK. And there's evidence that the Irish public agree with this policy choice. We commissioned separate surveys in 2018 and 2020, which both found that 82% of people in Ireland consider housing to be a basic human right. Enshrining the right to adequate housing in the Irish Constitution is particularly important as we move into a recovery phase following the COVID-19 pandemic and the lifting of the emergency tenancy protection policy measures. Today's report highlights 3 considerations on achieving adequate housing for everyone that I want to highlight and which Helen and the team will elaborate on further. Firstly, we are missing vital data. There's a need for more collection of equality data so that people's housing needs and outcomes can be measured. Data on ethnicity, travellers, refugees and asylum seekers are all significantly lacking in current surveys and administrative data. Secondly, on secure housing, important measures of housing adequacy, such as security, are not properly measured. We need to better measure the levels of instability in housing in Ireland. And thirdly, on COVID and homelessness, we're already seeing levels of homelessness rise following the lifting of pandemic protections. Homeless figures also exclude those in hidden homeless, living situations, those staying with friends or family, sofa surfing, or those who aren't engaging with homeless services. This research also measures the disadvantages experienced by young people, migrants, people with disabilities, travellers, and others in the Irish housing system. In terms of findings that relate to specific groups, we see that lone parents are found to be among the most disadvantaged in Ireland's housing market, particularly vulnerable to experiencing housing deprivation. That over 35% of Asian or Asian Irish people, 39% of travellers, and over 40% of Black or Black Irish people live in overcrowded accommodation. And as the nights grow longer, the report also finds that young people, migrants, lone parents, and people with a disability are especially likely to report an inability to keep a home warm compared to the total population. The issue of adequate housing received renewed attention with the government's publication of its Housing for All strategy, and now is a monumental moment for housing in a policy context. But as of today, there's no clear government commitment to ensure the right to adequate housing, only a pledge stemming from the programme for government to explore a referendum on housing, and that commitment is to be delivered through the Commission on Housing, which is yet to be established. The right to housing perspective is almost absent from the government's Housing for All strategy. As a Commission, we believe that a clearer commitment is needed by government to ensure the right to adequate housing. And the continuing problem of homelessness highlights a section of the community for whom the most basic measure of adequate housing is not being met. Homelessness is a persistent social problem in Ireland. Since 2014, in the context of a deepening housing crisis, there has been an unprecedented number of families entering homelessness who had never experienced homelessness before, particularly in the Dublin region. Family homelessness in Ireland disproportionately impacts lone parents, predominantly single mothers, socioeconomically disadvantaged households, ethnic minorities, and larger families, the majority of whom are losing their accommodation in the private rented sector and are unable to find an alternative home. Our recommendations, to conclude, we have restated our recommendation that the state enshrine the right to housing in the Constitution of Ireland. This will not fix the housing crisis alone, but it's an important step to reframe access to housing in Ireland and how we view Ireland access to housing. The state must adopt an explicit human rights and equality-based approach to the transition from COVID-19 to support a more just and equal society. The emergency measures adopted in 2020 to prevent homelessness demonstrate that dramatic state action is both possible and can be effective. An inclusive post-pandemic recovery programme requires long-term lessons to be learned about the need for policy responses to focus on permanent housing solutions for families. We believe that the provision of social and public housing is central to the solution to the homelessness and housing crisis. Finally, I wish to extend my thanks to Dr. Helen Russell and her team for their work on today's report. It marks the 10th and final published report, as Alan mentioned, since 2017 under the IHREC ESRI Irish Human Rights and Equality Research Series. On behalf of the Commission, I'd like to acknowledge the ESRI and all of the researchers, including in our own policy and research team, who've worked on these studies, and to thank you for your significant contribution to knowledge on equality and discrimination in Ireland. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Sinead. So thanks generally for the talk and also for the kind words about the ESRI's work on this. I presume you'll stick on the panel anyway, because when we go to the Q&A session,
absolutely, yeah,
make some remarks. Great. Okay, so with that, it's my great pleasure to hand over to my colleague Helen Russell, who will take us through the details of the report. So over to you, Helen.
Okay. So thank you very much, Sinead, and to the UN Rapporteur for their kind words about the report. So I'm presenting today on behalf of my colleagues, Ivan Valco, Francis McGinnity, and Shannon Enright. And I just like to add my thanks as well to the research team in IHREC and also to the CSO who provided much of the data that we're working on today. So, okay, let me move this on. So by way of background, why are we monitoring adequate housing? So we know housing is essential to people's quality of life, their well-being, their health, and to their participation in society. But it's also a social and economic right. And unlike probably many other housing reports from the ESRI, we're starting from that perspective. So starting from commitments in human rights agreements around the right to adequate housing. So our aim here is to develop a set of indicators that allow us to monitor progress, or indeed lack of progress in adequate housing, and to identify groups that might be left behind. So first, just to look at how adequate housing appears in those international agreements. So Ireland is a signatory to a number of conventions and agreements that mention the right to adequate housing. Firstly, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it appears here as a subheading of the right to an adequate standard of living. It's spelt out in more detail then in the International Convention on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. And also the Professor Raja Gopal mentioned it's also in things like the SDG goals. So the state and signatories to these agreements commit to the progressive realization of these rights. So we agree that we're on a path to progress adequate housing, and also this human rights approach commits to non-discrimination. So this is where it's important to monitor whether there's particular groups that are missing out in particular. So how has adequate housing been defined in these agreements? And this is drawing mostly on the IHREC. And we have grouped them into 6 key dimensions. And this is access to housing, affordability, cultural adequacy, security, quality, and then local environment and access to services. So what we do in this monitor is we consider the IHREC and other frameworks that look at quality of life or at housing in particular. And drawing on these, we developed a long list of indicators around adequate housing and of the dimensions, I suppose, that we want to look at. We then consulted with a range of stakeholders. 30 individuals and organizations attended a meeting at the ESRI just before it all closed down due to COVID. And I'm delighted that many of those participants are here today as well, and we thank them for their participation. And then we on the basis of those discussions and that review, we selected the best available indicators across the 6 dimensions. And then we use high quality, nationally representative data to look at adequate housing for different groups. And as mentioned, one of the important goals of this also is to identify gaps, data gaps of groups that aren't covered or dimensions of housing that aren't covered, because if they aren't included, then obviously progress can't be monitored. So in selecting the indicators, we had, I suppose, a set of criteria drawing on the lessons from previous exercises done by other bodies, and also by the EU group on data and collecting equality data. So these criteria include, that the indicators cover important areas of inequality and human rights, that they're measurable and measurable, robust, and high quality. Very importantly, that they allow for disaggregation across different groups. And also that they're timely and that they are repeated over time. So to monitor progress, obviously, we need to be revisiting these indicators, and also that they're meaningful for rights holders. So this presents here the whole range of indicators that we use in the monitor across the 6 dimensions of adequate housing, which are listed along the side. And we have 2 types of indicators. One are the individual level indicator, and these are measured at the level of the individual or the household. And they cover things like, you know, whether the person is experiencing poverty after housing costs. That's one of our affordability indicators. And we also then have this other set of indicators which are measured at the societal level, which we call aggregate indicators. So these are, say, something like the number of housing completions in the state. So obviously these are important measures in terms of access to housing as well, and across the other dimensions. You might see here that there's a gap here in terms of cultural adequacy. In that we can't identify individual level survey data for that we might use here. So we rely on, for that particular dimension of adequacy, we're looking more at aggregate, excuse me, aggregate level indicators. So I will present some of the findings on some of these indicators, but obviously only a selection. So then, whose outcomes are we interested in? Excuse me, sorry, I'm a bit trigger happy here with my with my mouse. So whose outcomes are we interested in? So we're looking in particular at groups, what we call equality groups, or these are groups that have protected characteristics that appear in the equality legislation. So I've outlined them here on the slide. We also include a measure of social origin. We use educational level as an indicator of this. Socioeconomic status is not currently a protected ground for equality legislation, but it is under consideration. Also, social assistance, receipt of social assistance is now has been added as a ground for protection under equality legislation in Ireland, and so you cannot discriminate against somebody in receipt of a housing assistance payment or a rent supplement, but we don't look at these as a separate group within the monitor. So moving on to some of the findings, and as I said at the start, these are baseline findings, and the idea is that we would then follow up on these indicators over time. So our first indicator in terms of access to housing focuses on housing tenure. So this is whether a person is in a owner-occupied housing, private rental housing, or local authority housing. And we draw here on the SILC survey, the Survey of Income and Living Conditions provided by the CSO. And this chart then shows us the proportion living. We're just looking here at the private rented accommodation piece of that outcome. And you can see that there's differences across age groups. So much more likely, younger age groups are much more likely to be in rented, private rented accommodation. We also see these strong differences by country of birth. So those from particularly Eastern Europe are much more likely to be in private rented accommodation, 80% of that group. We also see here in the pink, this is by household type, that lone parents are overrepresented in private rented accommodation. So almost half of that group are in private rented accommodation. Now, obviously, we can't, sorry, I'm skipping again. We can't tell from this particular indicator, you know, whether choice or constraint is involved. You know, some people may decide to rent, you know, if they're maybe in Ireland, but they're not, they aren't going to live here permanently. But there may also be constraint involved. So we've there was an interesting study by IHREC researchers, which found that 86% of those currently renting actually aspired to own a home. So, but just we need to keep that in mind in terms of interpreting the tenure results. The second indicator of access, of the access dimension is homelessness. And this is obviously a very fundamental indicator of inadequate access to housing. The data on homelessness is limited. Obviously, a lot of the surveys that we're using are of people in private households, and people who are homeless by definition aren't being sampled. So for this, we use figures from the Department of Housing on those accessing homeless services, and it's called the PASS data. And we can see from this is monthly data, and it's been collected over time. We can see that the numbers in homelessness was increasing from 2016 up to 2020, but then it declined in the year then to March 2021 during the pandemic, and we can see that is partly reflecting those exceptional measures that were taken during the pandemic to the moratorium on evictions and rent freezes. Sorry. There's not very much detail in terms of the characteristics of the homeless service users in the data, but we can see their family status, and they are predominantly single individuals, but amongst homeless families, as has been mentioned already, lone parents and their children are very significantly overrepresented. There is also an age of the service users, and we can see from this that the youngest age groups are overrepresented. So moving then to one of our measures of affordability. So we have 3 different indicators of affordability, and I'm just going to show you one here. And this is the proportion of people who are in rent or mortgage arrears in the previous 12 months. And this is, again, relying on SILC data. You see here there's not significant differences by age, really, except for the children are more likely to be living in households where there's rent or mortgage arrears. But again, we see these differences by country of birth. So in this case, we had to group some of the categories just because of the smaller numbers, but we can see that non-EU migrants in this case are more disadvantaged. So 12% are having affordability issues on this measure. We can see that those who have higher levels of education obviously are more advantaged. And again, the effect for lone parents. So 14% of lone parents had experienced rent or mortgage arrears, which is much higher than the other household types. And people with a disability, and 16% of that group had experienced arrears. And we see when we look in the report at the other measures of affordability, so whether you're in poverty after your housing costs are deducted from your income, those sort of measures, that the same patterns emerge across all those indicators. So moving to the dimension of cultural adequacy. As I say, we take a slightly different approach in this chapter, and we focus in particular on Irish travellers and on those in direct provision. And Irish travellers are a group. These are 2 groups, I suppose, that have particular needs around culturally appropriate housing. So we draw on a range of existing data and evidence here. So the Department of Housing statistics shows us that 8% of travellers were living in group housing in 2019 and 8% in local authority housing. And we compare these to evidence on the preferred accommodation from a survey of travellers in 2017. And you can see there's a mismatch here between preferred accommodation and where travellers are currently living. We also look in this chapter on the drawdown of funding for traveller-specific accommodation. And we can see that in 2019, approximately a third of that funding had not been drawn down, although this varied quite a lot across different local authorities. There is also evidence that travellers themselves, again in a survey that the Fundamental Rights Agency carried out in Ireland and in a number of other countries, that travellers themselves believe that there was insufficient traveller-specific accommodation, and this has also been recognised by other international bodies, that this is an issue where there are problems of adequacy. And we also see in the other findings across other dimensions that travellers are also experiencing problems of access and quality. So the final indicator that I'll show you here is one of our housing quality indicators, and this refers to overcrowding. So this on this particular indicator, we draw on census data for 2016, and the measure that we're using is the proportion. We're looking at the ratio of the number of people in the household to the number of rooms, and where there's more than one person per room, that's the definition that we're using here. And there's more details in the survey or in the report. But this is one of the few indicators where, because we're using the census, that we can actually look at the ethnic background of participants. So you can see here that the traveller group, Black, Irish, and Asian, and other ethnic minority backgrounds have much higher rates of overcrowded accommodation on this measure. We also see that there's that this is a problem predominantly for younger age groups again. So the 45 to 64 and 65 plus have a much lower rate of overcrowding here. And again, there's some differences in educational background. There's the people with a disability are less likely to be in overcrowded accommodation here, and that's probably related to the age profile of this group. So they're more likely probably to be in this older age group. So some of the data gaps that we identified, we said at the start that one of the aims of this is also to see where what issues and groups aren't covered, and this is important because what gets counted counts in terms of responses. So one of the issues that Sinead highlighted as well is that the lack of data on housing security. So we use in the study, we use a measure of length of tenure, but that's really not, that's very correlated with age and other factors. So it's not very satisfactory. There's also certain groups that aren't included routinely in surveys or that aren't identified in surveys, and this is ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, and the social origin. There was also, as I mentioned, a lack of data on cultural adequacy, but also on some of the other dimensions. So access to local services and experience of housing discrimination. Again, there has been a survey which looks at discrimination and access to housing, but there isn't sufficient numbers to disaggregate across the groups that we're interested in. So to conclude, just some of the key messages from the study. So on the baseline analysis, we see that younger respondents, migrants, particularly those from Eastern Europe, those with a disability, and lone parents are particularly disadvantaged in the housing system across a number of the dimensions that we look at. Although choice is likely to play a role in some of the group differences that emerge, other differences are that more clearly point to disadvantage. So such as, the measures of affordability or housing quality are more clearly pointing to disadvantage for groups. But because of the nature of the monitor is that we cannot get into, what are the processes underlying the indicators that we use. The report, as I said, establishes a baseline for future monitoring, and it highlights groups where the right to housing is right to adequate housing is problematic. The report also, I suppose, identifies that housing adequacy is very strongly linked to the broader concept of standard of living, to poverty and low income and structural inequalities. And I suppose one of the other messages was around the impact of the pandemic, and this has obviously clearly affected lots of areas of life, and those effects in terms of housing and adequate housing aren't fully apparent yet. So the data that we're using here really shows the situation in a lot of cases before the pandemic, and there will subsequently then become this data hopefully will become available, and we can see what that impact may be once some of those emergency protections have been lifted, and also where the problems in terms of house building and housing supply will be feeding through. So I am going to finish there, and I will open the floor to questions. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Helen. A lot of material to get through, but you did a great job in getting through it. Now, I noticed actually Ivan has been answering some questions through the chat function already. Okay, so I might ask Ivan in a couple of minutes, maybe to sort of summarize some of the questions that have come in and the sort of responses that he's giving. But let me kick off with just a couple of questions myself, if I may. And Sinead is welcome to sort of contribute to the answers on these ones. So my first question, it's back to the issue of lone parents. And you may or may not be able to answer this, and you may need to speculate. But one of the things I'm interested in is what's the mechanism that leads to lone parents having housing difficulties? And the question on my mind is the following. Is it, and you touched on this in the concluding remarks, I mean, often when we look at things like, say, we've done seminars on fuel poverty and food, and various dimensions of poverty. And here we're kind of looking at housing poverty. And there's a sense that the problem is poverty, okay? And, it's not specific. So I'm wondering here, is the lone parenthood issue, sort of generally a poverty-related question? Or is there an additional sort of housing dimension? And I'm struck, Sinead, of course, you were on Morning Ireland this morning, and there was a person talking in advance. I think she was talking about the difficulty that if you're a lone parent and you're showing up for, to try and rent a place, and you feel you're doing it, it's like doing a job interview, and there can be discrimination. So I'm wondering, do we have any sort of sense of, is this a lone parent poverty problem? Or is there an additional sort of discriminatory dimension which compounds an already tricky question? So I'll put it to you first, Helen, if I might, and then Sinead, maybe you'd like to come in on that.
I mean, I think that's a really important point in that, it's very difficult to separate, adequate housing from adequate income, because those two things are absolutely linked. And so it's, and we know from a lot of our other research in the ESRI that lone parents and their children do experience much higher levels of poverty and deprivation, experience difficulties in exiting poverty in terms of securing employment, because they have particular issues of having to combine sole care of a child and along with employment, and there's issues around benefits and as well as that. So I think the we can't formally separate how much poverty or low income is driving the inadequate housing, but I'd say that is a massive part of it. And so the solution is not just about housing. It's about adequate income. It's about childcare. It's about access to employment and all those other things as well. So I think that's really important to look at. Sure. On the discrimination side, we haven't got evidence of that, in terms of quantitative evidence. But as Sinead may contribute there's anecdotal evidence on that.
And Helen, sorry, if I could just interrupt for a second. It's just from a previous report in the research programme on the experience of discrimination in housing. That's sort of self-reports from survey data in the past 2 years. Have you personally felt discriminated against while you were looking for housing and accommodation? And yes, lone parents report much higher rates, 2, 3, 4 times the amount, the discrimination rate of non-lone parents. So I think that's from another report, not this one.
Interesting. Sinead, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I would indeed, Helen, have that kind of anecdotal feedback. We don't in IHREC have any further quantitative data on the discrimination experienced by lone parents in housing, but anecdotally, and probably more from my work prior to IHREC in supporting lone parents. I was chair of one family and worked in that area and advocated for lone parents for a long time. And the stories are true that people, particularly in a housing market where it's, a landlord can pick and choose, the appeal of a lone parent is less. They are perceived to be less secure, is how I would recount the experiences that I've been told about. So I think it's, and to answer your question, Alan, I think it's about poverty, but it's also about the complexity that I think lone parents find themselves in terms of you're juggling so many different schemes. And as you mentioned, Helen, for example, back to work schemes or back to education schemes, you might be trying to manage all of that alongside being on a housing list or accessing, the different services and provisions that you need. And it makes it just very hard to then, see how you can move out of perhaps a less than ideal home situation or housing situation. And that's, I think, why we're seeing come through in this report, the deprivation levels looking so high and the affordability issues so high. I mean, and I spoke on Morning Ireland this morning and talked about my own experience of being a lone parent. I come from a very privileged background where this has not been as big a challenge for me, but nonetheless it was. I mean, I lived from the first 4 years of my daughter's life, I was back in my home, my family home, in a single bed in my childhood bedroom with her. And I come from a family that shouldn't, technically in a wealthy family where I should be able to afford my own home. So if I'm experiencing that level of difficulty, imagine when you don't have that backing, that financial backing, perhaps financial security that I would have enjoyed. Like for me, the experience is that there is, in so many of our systems and institutions, a one size fits all when it comes to families, when it really, the perception of what a family is comes in the shape of a mum and a dad and a 2 parents. And obviously we've had the marriage equality referendum, which has at least updated us to the gender of the parents, but we still don't, I believe, have this recognition that so many families are headed by one parent, lone parents, and responded to that in a policy context at all.
Okay, Sinead, I'm going to direct a question from Robert Manelli, and it's about the right to housing. So let me read the question as best I can, and then hopefully you can deal with this. So anyway, there's a right to reference in the programme for government. But Robert says, I understand that such a right's primary utility is to allow the Attorney General and the courts to interpret government decisions more in favour of the provision of housing where a conflict arises. So is that how you would see the benefit of such a constitutional amendment? And are there examples which come to mind of recent decisions where an amendment would have changed outcomes? So Robert has asked a very specific question, but I have to say I'm interested in this myself, and I think a lot of other people would be on the call. What precisely would be the practical benefit of a constitutional, the assertion of the Constitution of right to housing, whatever? Do you want to take a minute or two on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't suppose just yet, to be honest, because I think it's so far there was in the programme for government, there is a commitment to a referendum on the right to housing, but that is dependent on the establishment of the Commission for Housing. So we're a long ways away from any discussion around it, and I wouldn't make any supposition about what it will ultimately look like. I think, as you know, for us, I think that the benefit to enshrining it in the Constitution is not about the provision of a house for everyone. That's not what it means. What it means that there are protections introduced to prevent homelessness, to provide for adequate housing, and it really repositions the state's role and purpose in housing as a right rather than a commodity. So for me, you know, the ideological, if you like, and the sea change that we need to see in people's attitudes towards housing would be really shifted were we to look for a referendum. I mean, if you recall the last two referendums we've had around appealing the 8th Amendment and around access to marriage equality, the conversations and the discussions around them were so rich and so strong. And I think it really shifted public opinion hugely. So that's one of the benefits of having that referendum, is what it can do in terms of public discourse and the perception of what housing is, rather a right rather than a commodity.
Okay, I'm going to read actually some very long questions coming in, so it's kind of hard for me to give a synopsis, but a contribution from Gunnar Thiessen, and I'll just read it. So, concerning single parents and their children, besides income poverty, there may be other factors. So, insufficient social benefits for children and lone parents, lack of public childcare making it difficult for lone parents to access work, lack of child support from other fathers who do not want to take care of children and difficulties to enforce them, lack of security and tenure in the case of family background. So I think the broad point there is, again, this notion of going to use this very multifactorial discrimination. So I think just the full complexity has been brought out there. A question more for the researchers then from Breed O'Brien. Again, I'll just read it, guys. So, was principal economic status data used to explore the impact of employment status on people's ability to secure adequate housing? So I don't know, were you using ILO or PES definitions, or does it make a big difference in this case?
Well, in this analysis, we weren't actually looking at employment status at all. So this is obviously would be a key mediating factor, you know, that would be linking disability and, you know, outcomes or lone parenthood and these adequacy outcomes, you know, so it's, but we're looking at this descriptively, we're not actually looking at the underlying process, but so that is a key underlying factor there that will explain some of these patterns. But what the socioeconomic indicator that we use here is education, because we're trying to tap into people's social origin rather than just looking at that as a sort of current circumstance. Right. Yeah.
And then Breed also asked then if overcrowding is an issue for people in low paid employment or on social welfare payments. So again, were we able to pick up those specifics?
So again, you see, we're not looking at the processes behind, but yeah, no, we are. I can't answer that one, I'm afraid.
That is no problem at all. And a question from Camille Loftus, still on lone parents. Might the smaller size of lone parent households be an issue? And what she's asking is, traditional social housing tended to be built for bigger families. So is it the case that if, like, are people, I should know this, but I don't, are people with sort of bigger families higher up housing lists and stuff like that?
Well, I think you have the same complexity for larger families, actually, because, and I know that the traveller community have a particular issue with that because they do have on average larger families. So I do think family size, I think if it's small or large, is going to go against you because of the standardisation of housing units, if you like, or the perception, again, that we come in packages of a certain size. And
I think, yeah, when we discussed this before, it was around that the especially local authority housing traditionally was those, you know, 3-bedroomed houses, and actually it was the individuals who were single person household that weren't being provided for. So it's important that that whole range of households is considered, you know, that we're not just, you know, have some traditional idea of what a family is or what homes are indeed, which I think that a lot of that discussion about apartments recently was very telling, that somehow people living in apartments weren't that they weren't homes. Only the 3-bed semis were homes. So I think we need to you know, that certainly is an issue in terms of the stock of local authority housing. All right.
Okay, and Jerry Riley has reported on, the CSO Pulse survey. So let me just read out the figures. So according to this, almost 60% of lone parents living in rented accommodation said they often experience judgmental attitudes or exclusion as a lone parent. And that compares to just 23% of lone parent homeowners who don't have there does seem to be, based on that CSO data anyway, sort of, again, more the sort of indicators of discrimination and negative judgments or whatever like that Fran touched on earlier on. Okay, we're kind of coming towards the end of the event, but I had another question that I did want to ask, and I'm not sure if it's picked up in the report or not, but it's the issue. So you talk about insecurity, okay, where people are worried about whether or not they'll move. But I was interested in that situation in which people actually do move a lot. Okay, and I've often thought, again, it's like that notion, housing as a right, but it's not just the house. It's been embedded in your community and embedded in your local primary school if you've got kids, and your support structures and all those sort of things. And again, possibly something that you weren't able to sort of pick up on. But presumably this can be, and maybe we could get it from other sort of sources, GUI or whatever else, that if you're, well, even if you're adult and you have to move a lot, but also if you're a child and you have to move an awful lot, presumably that has, so you could be moving from okay accommodation to okay accommodation, but the breaks. And any sort of thoughts on that, or any sense?
No, I think that's really is an interesting research question, and it's something as well that came up in the consultation. That actually, the increase in private rental accommodation, is likely to be associated with this increased transiency, and that really does make forming communities and support networks, which we know are really important, that it makes that much more difficult. So I think with the dimensions of housing adequacy that we outlined at the start, that local environment one often gets lost, and again, it's not actually very well covered in the data that we have, but it actually is really important for people's quality of life. And as you say, the GUI is a good resource in this respect for families with children, so that you can see that neighborhoods do have an additional effect over and above, families and schools. So it's important to have that dimension in.
Okay, Sinead, I'm going to come to you in a second to close things out, but I was just aware in the Q&A section that Ivan was responding. There was a sort of a discussion there about housing outputs and vacancies and things like that. So Lorcan Sir has provided kind of a nice summary for some of that discussion, and he makes the point that housing completions do not mean accessible, affordable, or well located. He said there are about 3 metrics for assessing successful housing policy, and simply counting housing output is the most basic and the one that seems to get mentioned so often. So I think that is a point. I mean, we talk about the number of houses that are needed every year, and that's important, but obviously those houses, or those housing units or whatever like that, need additional characteristics to tackle some of the issues that we've been discussing today. So we are coming towards a close. Sinead, maybe you'd like to, I can kind of sign off at this point, just to again thank everybody for logging on today and for engaging in the discussion. Again, thanks to our IHREC colleagues, and some parting words of wisdom then, Sinead.
Thanks, Alan. Parting words of wisdom. Oh, really, just a huge thank you to you guys for, again, another quality report, which is just such an important contribution to this debate. I mean, I said it in some of the media outputs I've done today. There is a real, kind of calling, I think, in the current debate and discussion around housing for moving away from quantifying in the way that we have done, and to moving towards framing and perceiving housing in a different way. And I just think this is so valuable a contribution in that context. So thank you to all of you for that, and for the event today, and to everyone for coming along.
Great, thanks for that. So we wish everybody a good evening, and we'll look forward to talking to you all again sometime soon. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks.